And of course, I need to cover everything about autonomous vehicle technology and the technology implementation curve and the intended and unintended consequences on cities and everything that we need to be doing now in order to welcome this new technology in 15 minutes. So first of all, some lingo. We've got lots of acronyms, but we see autonomy as part of a suite of emerging mobility services. There's actually nothing from a sort of mobility implication standpoint that's particularly unique or dramatic about autonomy. But what is remarkable is the fact that autonomy gives us a lot of flexibility. It also allows us to redefine the nature of mobility as simply movement and really an opportunity for capturing the value of time of the people inside the vehicles. So when we look at technology, we look at autonomy in the context of car sharing, of micromobility, all the little scooters that we see out there here in Atlanta, ride-hailing in the form of Uber, Lyft, and other providers, microtransit in the form of Chariot and others. All of these services are making us rethink in some subtle ways how we, or really what the role is of mobility in cities. We also need to start thinking now about unintended negative consequences. So back in the 1930s, we had pretty much laid out the entire regulatory framework for how automobiles got accommodated in cities. For example, the American Automobile Association and General Motors went to every state legislature to criminalize walking for the first time by defining jaywalking and making that illegal, which previously had never been in human history, because they realized that they couldn't sell cars if we couldn't make cars fast in cities. That had some unintended negative consequences. Left to their own devices, Silicon Valley companies are really, really fantastic at providing greater convenience for the most privileged. They're not so good at actually meeting the needs of cities unless cities assert themselves. And so one of the starting places that we look at as we look at autonomy is making sure that autonomy is more about greater efficiency through accommodating sharing versus greater convenience and more congestion by having everyone in their own little Tesla pod. So as we look at autonomy, we look at it in connection with having those autonomous vehicles connected to each other, having them be shared, and having them be electric. This is the starting point for a non-dystopic accommodation of autonomous vehicles. Another thing that we realize is that the data that we are seeing with Uber and Lyft is exactly the data that we will start seeing with autonomy. That Uber and Lyft are autonomous vehicles, except for that they have a driver. And both Uber and Lyft are working as fast as they possibly can to get rid of the driver. The service model doesn't change all that much. The price at which it can be available to consumers, however, drops. So what are we seeing with Uber and Lyft? Well, we're seeing a huge increase in their utilization in cities all over the world. We're seeing that matched in most cities by a dramatic decrease in the use of conventional taxis, an industry that was regulated for the problems of the 1930s and therefore could not adapt. There was no reason why Uber and Lyft should have displaced conventional taxis, except for the fact that their regulation cared nothing about the customer. So taxis are dying. We're also seeing in cities all over the United States, public transit use falling off dramatically, with a couple of very important exceptions to watch, most notably Seattle, and we might get to some of those reasons later. And the end result of all of these patterns is that Uber and Lyft are resulting in a significant improvement in convenience, particularly for evening, weekend, going out to the bars sort of trips, and particularly for young people. But this increase in convenience is also producing a dramatic increase in vehicle miles traveled, in congestion in cities, and a reduction in the ability of city streets to move people. So cities like New York and San Francisco and Seattle and Los Angeles, city streets have the capacity to move fewer and fewer people over time as a result of the success of Uber and Lyft. that convenience and efficiency are enemies. Nevertheless, our industry is ripe for disruption, in part because it is the most inefficient sector in our economy. A typical car is used about 5% of its useful life. The rest of the time it sits parked. And of the 5% of its useful life that a car is used, it's typically used at about 20% capacity. My industry operates on a 2% efficiency margin. And in fact, is grossly disconnected from the entire world of economics. So you'll recall from Econ 101 that there's the supply curve and the demand curve, and that magical place where the lines cross is the right price, the price that allows industry to be able to produce the good, make a profit, satisfy consumer demand. This is how we balance supply and demand for every commodity in our society: food, clothing, housing, your cell phone bill, except for mobility, where we use time to balance supply and demand rather than price. Congestion is simply what happens when the demand for mobility equals the supply, and we ask people to wait in line in order to use the road rather than to pay an efficient price. And this results in the technologists defining the problem incorrectly. So Elon Musk believes that he can solve traffic congestion. You know, stuck there on the Santa Monica freeway, it's very obvious that if you're unhappy in congestion, you could raise money and add another lane off to the side and make driving faster. And if you can no longer add a lane off to the side, right, you can just do it underneath. Great, problem solved. And this is how most of the technology world operates, except they don't understand the secondary consequences. So making driving faster means, honey, why don't we move to the bigger, cheaper house farther away, which then results in congestion. And basically every city in America is stuck in this death spiral. The only city in the United States that has solved its congestion problem is Detroit, which did so by destroying its regional economy. Congestion is an economic problem. It is not an infrastructure or technology problem. That when technology gives us speed, we do not use it to save time. We use it to consume more space. This is a quote from Emily Badger in the New York Times. So what do? Well, key question is, like, what's the absorption curve? And this is the great mystery. I'm not going to prognosticate. Many people have many answers, but it is useful to look at history of the absorption curve of other consumer products like refrigerators and the private automobile and color television and so on. And we know that the absorption curve, I mean, my car is a 1995 Geo-Tracker, which I do not intend to get rid of, because I have great affection for it. So there will be a curve. The question is, when does that curve start? And so I'm not going to give an answer to this other than to say that all of the things that we need to do in order to accommodate autonomous vehicles without dire negative consequences are things that we should be doing already. So let's get with it and use autonomy and technology as the excuse to finally manage the transportation system for the public good. So I'm going to give you 5 quick rules. Number 1, make it shared. And this is because of the basic geometry of streets. It takes up 10 times as much space to move somebody in a private car than any other mode of transportation. And this is true whether you're driving your own car, or you're in an Uber, or you're in an autonomous Uber, right? There is a simple geometric limitation of city streets in cities where we are no longer demolishing poor neighborhoods in order to widen highways. So the starting point needs to be municipalities asserting public ownership over the public right-of-way. And this is the real reason why autonomous vehicles will be successful, unlike Hyperloop and personal rapid transit and other exotic forms, because the autonomous vehicle can take advantage of existing infrastructure. It is resilient. So as we invite private enterprise to profit off of the public right-of-way, it is essential that cities assert their ownership of that right-of-way and manage the public right-of-way for the public good. And this means taking advantage of the fact that because there are evil corporations operating in the public right-of-way rather than noble individuals, that we can finally price mobility effectively. And the right price for mobility is always the lowest price that allows the system to operate efficiently. This means also prioritizing multi-occupancy vehicles, particularly high-capacity transit. For the first 5 years of autonomy, the best use cases for autonomy are low-speed parking lot shuttles, autonomous freight, and bus rapid transit operating in dedicated right-of-way. It is so important for transit agencies to take the lead on technology development for autonomous bus rapid transit, and for municipalities to take the lead at dedicating right-of-way for the most space-efficient and socially efficient modes of transportation, in large part because I can run 10 times as many people in a dedicated bus lane than I can in a general purpose lane. This is essential, and we should be doing it now, even when we still have bus drivers. It also means recognizing that none of this works unless we put walking and biking and scootering and all forms of human-powered micromobility first. And this means starting with the curb, right? So eliminating that conflict between an increased amount of curbside pickup and drop-off for Amazon deliveries, for Uber and Lyft, and for future autonomous vehicles. Eliminate that conflict with people trying to ride a bike by using parking protected bikeways now and separated micromobility lanes so that that critical space in the curb can be used with autonomy without messing up everyone else's lives and forestalling the very accurate prediction of the public health outcomes of ubiquitous door-to-door mobility presented to us in the film WALL-E. Of course, we also need to manage the public right-of-way by incentivizing low-carbon fuels. An advantage of autonomy is that electric autonomous vehicles can refuel themselves. Gas-powered ones have a really hard time with that. So this is some potential good news with autonomy, but we have to pressure it to make it work. Finally, and I would argue most importantly, if we want technology to actually solve our problems and make the world a better place, we need to do a much better job at defining our problems and also defining and measuring social equity, because private corporations are not going to do it for us. So that means starting with strong and clear data protocols, particularly open APIs, the codes that computer programs use to talk to each other. So ensuring that cities are getting the data that they need, and that all mobility that's operating in the public right-of-way takes universal payment and provides universal information and accessibility about itself. Cities need to collude with each other and ideally follow the protocols established by the National Association of City Transportation Officials. It also means potentially reorganizing government around mobility. I believe firmly in public mobility, but I don't know that public transit agencies need to exist. What I do know is that public agencies have to manage mobility for the public good, and that means defining it and potentially taking an approach with our streets like the federal government does with the airwaves through the Federal Communications Commission. It's a whole other long story. It means paying attention to the fact that there are 4.4 million Americans whose job is driver, including many members of my own family. Not all of those jobs are going away, and not all of them are going away immediately, but a lot of them are going away. And if you think the politics of this country are dire right now, imagine putting 4.4 hard-working Americans out of work. We need to get serious about the labor implications of autonomy and not just say we're creating all these new programmer jobs that the truck drivers in your family can take. Thank you.